You've been following the news, all of the events that are going on, not only in terms of natural disasters. We've had a lot of negotiation with the Philippines trying to work out a deal to keep the two big bases we have in the Philippines. It looks like a volcano is about ready to wipe out both of them. One of them's already been swallowed up, and the one they evacuated to, Subic Bay, is now under threat, and they're getting ready to evacuate Subic Bay as well. And they really don't have any place else much to evacuate to over there. So tremendous natural disasters that are going on literally worldwide, and there have been some interesting statements made in terms of the volcanic and earthquake activity, which of course are related, and it sort of reminds you of what Christ said in Matthew 24. But there's been some interesting statements made about that. There's sort of a Pacific Rim called the Ring of Fire that is an area of volcanic and earthquake activity that encircles a great area there. But it is something that we see not only an upsurge in some of those things of massive consequence. All flights in and out of Manila now have been canceled because there's such a pileup of volcanic ash on the runway that visibility is down to almost zero, and they've got a 5-inch layer of ash on the road. So even emergency vehicles, that's not threatened by the lava flow, that's just the ash from many, many miles away where the volcano is. So you might certainly remember that we do have quite a number of brethren in the Philippines, and it is something that we certainly want to be praying about, that God will watch over and protect His people. But there are a number of things that we see going on. Not only that, in terms of natural disasters, but if you've also focused in on the news, just within the last couple of days, there was an election in the Soviet Union, in Russia proper, which technically is slightly over half the population of the Soviet Union and the majority of its territory. The Soviet Union really is just sort of the outgrowth of the old Russian Empire. The Russians conquered back at the time of the Tsars. But anyway, the election was in Russia proper, and if you followed the election there, of course, the communists, first election that has ever been held where a variety of candidates have been allowed, and the Communist Party candidate was absolutely trounced. Nikolai Ryzhkov, who was the formerly been Soviet Prime Minister under Gorbachev, only received 16% of the vote. And Yeltsin, who had broken with the Communist Party and ran as a non-communist candidate with his goal in mind, what he said was that it was time for Russia to rejoin Europe. This was his platform. He won 60% of the vote. In Leningrad, the old Tsarist capital, an election was held over what should be the name of the city. And the majority of the population voted to go back to the old name the city had under the Tsars of St. Petersburg. So certainly a giant repudiation of Lenin, of the Communist Party, of everything that represents, that is very obvious right in Russia proper. But an interesting slogan that it's time to rejoin Europe. And of course the Pope is planning a trip to Russia in 1992. And there are a number of ramifications to that. I think there are a lot of things that await being seen. 1992, of course, December 31st, 1992 is the date that all internal barriers are supposed to be dropped within the common market, and it is supposed to be, at that point, Europe without borders. That's the statement that has been made. So there are many, many things that certainly bear our watching. Now, these things aren't directly related to what I wish to address today in the sermon, but I do think that from time to time it is important to call our attention to things that are going on in the news and to be aware of the world in which we live and the circumstances that are transpiring around us, because we are supposed to watch, we are supposed to pray and stay close to God. We're supposed to be alert, not only alert in terms of our own relationship with God, but certainly alert to the world around us and the fulfillment of the very things that Jesus Christ himself talked about. There are many things that are focused on, many things that we see in relationship to the family in terms of news, in terms of things that are debated. There was an excellent article, by the way, in editorial in Newsweek magazine that George Will wrote that sort of tied in with some comments that I had made in a sermon here back in May, just about a month ago. In regards to the family. Now, one of the things that we find, one of the problems in terms of families, is that the whole concept of the roles that individuals are to play in a family, the concept of what is a man, what is a father, what is he supposed to do, what is a mother, what is a woman, what is she supposed to do, the roles of masculinity and femininity, the roles that reveal the roles in the family unit are very much under debate and discussion. They can't even agree on some of these things. There was a great outcry in, I believe it was Wisconsin or Minnesota. I believe it was, Wisconsin. That in teaching sex education in the schools. Now, what the controversy was on was not the fact of whether to teach it or not. The issue was that they say that there's a problem, and one of the things is that the ACLU is filing a lawsuit against the use of the particular textbook that they're using for sex education in Wisconsin schools, and one of the reasons is that this particular book presents two-parent heterosexual couples as the sole model of a healthy, real family. And now this really had the ACLU up in arms. They say, why, that's not, you're saying that a two-parent heterosexual family is better than other families. That, that's better than having homosexuals adopt someone, or having single-parent households, or maybe, kind of commune living, or whatever alternative they've come up with. It shows you how far we've gone in terms of any set of values, that something like that's even debatable. That someone would even debate and even wish to make a serious argument against the fact that the ideal is one man and one woman who love one another, who marry, who stay married, who have children, and raise those children. And yet the idea of holding that up as the ideal shows how far things have gone, that there's even a lawsuit in Wisconsin saying, well, you shouldn't be teaching people that that's better than anything else. That's just one among many alternatives. And who's to say that one alternative is better than another? Well, I'll tell you who's to say that one alternative is better than another. God is to say that one alternative is better than another. Now, there are many problems and many aspects we could go into in regards to the family and the crisis that we have in this country, because we increasingly do have a crisis. Over 20% of the births that took place in this country in 1990 were illegitimate. Now that is an incredible statistic. The problems that exist, that are increasingly rampant all over and all throughout our society, so much of them come back to the roles in the family and the understanding of what those roles are. Now, there are all kinds of ideas. Now, several weeks ago, we focused in on a woman's role and on aspects of that and the importance of that. I want to focus in today on some aspects of the father's responsibility, because society doesn't seem to understand. You have the whole gamut of ideas. Increasingly, what you have is not simply uninvolved fathers. You have totally absent fathers who are not even present. You've got 25% of the births that took place in this country in 1990 that were illegitimate. So you didn't even have a father who was there, who was the legal and present parent. Now, when you add to that the growing tragedy of broken homes and children who are reared apart from their natural parents, that just multiplies it. When you look at even cases where the father is physically present, and yet you look at the involvement that is there and at the activity that is there and at his role in the family, because again, society can't arrive at a balance. They don't understand that in some cases you see men who have seemingly become so emasculated and so feminized that they don't understand what a father's supposed to do, and they don't understand how a father's role differs from a mother's role. And there are others who are simply not involved in regards to their families at all. And all sorts of things in between, all sorts of ideas, none of which are the right ideas. I would like to focus in the remainder of the sermon today on what I feel are the three most important things that a father can give his family. The three most important things that a father can give his family. Now, these, as I say, these are what I feel to be the three most important things, but I believe that this represents not simply my opinion, but I'm going to show you out of the pages of the Bible that God focuses in on these characteristics and these concepts and shows the importance of these things. The first of these three characteristics that I wish to focus on is that of loyalty. Loyalty is one of the most important things that a father can give his family. Loyalty underlies the very basis and existence of the family. When the first instructions that are ever recorded in terms of the family is when God presented Eve to Adam. And in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21, the eternal God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of the ribs, and he closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the eternal God had taken from the man, he made a woman, and he brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she is taken out of man. Then in verse 24, we have a statement that Jesus stated plainly in Matthew 19:5 was what God himself said. Here's what God said to Adam. We just got through seeing what Adam said when God brought Eve to him. Now here's what God said. In that sense, the words of the first marriage ceremony. Verse 24, Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now, we're told here that for this purpose of marriage, a man shall leave father and mother and cleave unto his wife. Here is the basis of marriage, the basis of faithfulness and loyalty. Loyalty underlies the family relationship because it is based on the fact of the loyalty of a husband to his wife and his loyalty, therefore, to his children. The importance of this is underlined in Exodus chapter 20 when God spoke the Ten Commandments. And the seventh of those commandments was, thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now here was a statement that again underlined the importance of loyalty. The importance of loyalty, of faithfulness of a man to the covenant that he made in the presence of God and whatever assembled witnesses there were. A covenant of loyalty and faithfulness to his wife. In Matthew chapter 19, we've already made reference to that, but in Matthew chapter 19, the Pharisees, we're told, came to Christ tempting him, wishing to entrap and entangle him in one of their multitudinous arguments, and their specific question had to do with divorce and the basis by which it was lawful for a man to put away his wife. Jesus did not entangle himself in their debate and striving about words. Rather, he focused in on the principle. He focused on the spirit of the law. He focused in on what is God's intent. What was God's purpose and desire from the very beginning? And that underlies our understanding of what is the spirit of the law. You know, that's what we have to focus upon in any issue that arises. What is the spirit of the law? What is God after? What does God wish? What is the mind of Christ? Not simply look through and try to find some technical loophole that we think God didn't plug up sufficiently, and so we can sneak out through that one and do what we want to do. You know, Christ was not dealing with the matter in that way at all. He focused in on the spirit of the law, the intent, God's purpose, God's design from the beginning, and he said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore there are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So there is a loyalty that is to be there, that is not to be undercut, that is not to be treated lightly or casually. The very basis of marriage, you know, the difference between marriage, when you go through there are various, and you can look in the Bible in terms of let's say, outward customs of what solemnizes the marriage. And the specific words of a marriage ceremony are not given in the Scriptures. When we have marriage ceremonies in God's church, we tend to focus back on the basic instructions that God gave to husbands and wives. But there is no specific outline in the Scripture of an exact marriage ceremony that needs to be followed. There's room for what is appropriate under the circumstances, but one thing that there's no deviation from, and one thing you see from the beginning, is the emphasis on commitment, the emphasis on a formal covenant that is entered into. A covenant of faithfulness and loyalty. A covenant, an agreement, a commitment. And that's something that is vastly different than the practice of, quote, living together that so many want to engage in today. And say, well, you know, what's the difference? I mean, what's wrong with that? You know, we'll just kind of live together for a while and see if it works out. There's no commitment. There's no basis for loyalty and devotion and forsaking of all others. There's no commitment. There's no loyalty. And so as a result, many times people find themselves, women find themselves, they're the ones that really are the greatest losers because they they get stuck with the kids, and he heads off down the road when he's looking for grass that's greener on the other side, or just gets tired of the responsibility, or whatever it is, and there he goes.
because there's not a sense of loyalty. Faithfulness in marriage, and of course that involves the whole concept of morality. Morality is based on the fact, the importance that loyalty plays in a marriage, of faithfulness, of one man being faithful to his one wife. So that's one aspect of loyalty. Now, that's not the only aspect of loyalty, but that is a very important aspect, the aspect of faithfulness, of being faithful, of a man being faithful to his wife. But another aspect of loyalty, an extension of that loyalty involves being protective of his wife and his family, because our loyalty is expressed not simply in our words, but it's expressed in our actions. It's involved in being protective. The statement is made in Ephesians chapter 5, where we're told in verse 23 that the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. And it comes on down a little bit further. It says in verse 25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Here we have a loyalty, a devotion, a protective aspect of Christ's relationship with the church was such that he was willing to sacrifice himself for it. We're told, husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church. So how is a husband to love his wife? What is the role model for how a husband ought to love his wife? The role model is Jesus Christ and how he loved the church. And that love was a sacrificial love. It was a willingness to protect. He gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of the water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it might be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. So it talks about in verse 31, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. So the emphasis here is that he is to be protective, and it talks about in verse 33, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself. You know, it's easy to be conscious of ourselves and our needs. If I'm hungry, I'm very conscious of it. If I get hurt, if I injure myself and feel pain, experience pain, I'm very conscious of that. If I'm tired, I'm conscious of that. The things that impact me personally and physically, I have no problem being conscious of. We're conscious of our needs. We're conscious of the physical limitations that we have when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're hurt, when we are experiencing certain things. There are built-in warning systems in our body. We feel it. It's very easy to be conscious of that. If you've ever had, a hurt leg or foot, you know how you favor that when you walk. You're conscious not to put extra weight on it because you feel it. And if you step down in a normal way, you feel it. And so you favor that foot. Or the same can be with an injured arm or hand. We favor it. We do various things. The rest of the body sort of works to compensate because we're conscious of the pain. We're conscious of the limitation. It's not a problem. It comes naturally to be conscious of the pain and the difficulty and the limitations that we ourselves have. What doesn't come naturally is to be just as conscious, just as concerned, just as focused on the pain, on the difficulty, on the tiredness, on the limitations that our mates have. See, that's what it means when it says, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself. Be protective of your wife in the same way that you are protective of yourself. That's a natural instinct of self-preservation. But loyalty, in the context of the family, in the context of loyalty to our family, to our wives, to our children, loyalty involves a willingness to sacrifice and a willingness to do these various things. There are many examples, many things of loyalty that you can focus in on. The examples in the Scriptures, loyalty that is described right here in the context of Christ and the church. There are personal examples of loyalty. There may be examples that you can think of in terms of your own experience. I know a particular example that has always impressed me from the time of childhood was a story that I heard regarding my own family. There's only one of my grandparents that I ever knew, my mother's mother, my grandmother, and she lived with us during the final years of her life, during the time that I was growing up and on until her death, which was 2 or 3 years after I was grown and married. But anyway, various things examples and things that she had said. One thing that particularly stood out in my mind, because my grandmother had not grown up in the home with her parents. Both of her parents died when she was very young. Her mother died when she was about 3 and a half, and her father died within the same year. She was 4, but just barely. And they had lived up in the hills of Arkansas, in fact, up in the vicinity. I think maybe 1 or 2 of you were going up to Hot Springs, but it was in that general vicinity, in the hills of Arkansas, up in the mountain area there where she was born, where her family lived. But when her parents died, when her father died, some relatives of her mother's had taken her in, and her father's family, the only family that he had, was one brother who was a tenant farmer down in Mississippi. And word reached him of the fact of his brother's death and the fact that 4 little children had been left, all young children, 3 of them, all 4 little girls that had been left as a result of his brother's death. And he, in response to that news, and of course news took a while to go back and forth, they didn't get on the telephone and call, but anyway, word reached him, and he hitched up a team and wagon, and he made the trip from the place where he was in Mississippi up to Arkansas, and the round trip took him 6 weeks, traveling by team and wagon, and this was in the year 1889. My grandmother was 4 years old. Now, her uncle only had 12 children of his own that he was trying to raise there, as I say, a tenant farmer in Mississippi, and yet here were 4 little girls, ranging from about 7 years old on down. So it was not as though that there was going to be some great economic boom to the family by taking these in, but the point that always impressed me was the loyalty that he exemplified in taking in these extra children and bringing them down, rearing them up as his own, and providing for them as best that he could during those years. And there is a concept of loyalty that is very important as far as a scriptural standpoint. We live in such a convenience-oriented society. People don't want to be bothered by claims of loyalty, whether it's loyalty to their country or loyalty to their mate or loyalty to their family or loyalty to someone for whom they work or loyalty to just about anything or anyone except for themselves. We live in a very selfish, self-centered society, a society that places its premium on the individual and on the individual, quote, fulfilling himself. And when you place a premium on that sort of thing, then other areas that involve loyalty and duty and responsibility, those things get lost in the shuffle. Loyalty involves faithfulness. It involves a protective instinct and a protectiveness. It involves providing. That's an aspect. A man who is loyal to his family is going to seek to provide for that family. That's why when the Scriptures laid emphasis on that, and Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, that if any provide not for his own, and especially those of his own house, he's denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So this is obviously not talking about someone who's incapacitated because of some accident or injury or illness. It is talking about an attitude and a willingness to carry responsibility. It is talking about loyalty. It's talking about someone who recognizes responsibility and recognizes that involves getting out and working and providing and taking responsibility for his household, for his family. That's a part of loyalty. See, loyalty is not just a word. Loyalty is not just some sort of concept that you hang somewhere. Loyalty has to do with action. Loyalty is reflected in not simply what we say, but what we do. And when we look at any aspect of loyalty today in the context of even this country, loyalty to the nation or to its ideals, loyalty to the family, loyalty in the context of God's church, it can be loyalty in any aspect, and yet we live in a society that has placed so much emphasis on convenience, on individuality, and there has been a lack of emphasis of loyalty. The stress is an interesting concept brought out in a recent article that I was reading. It was talking about the stress, or the fact that the modern stress in terms of education is much more on personality than on character. And it drew a contrast between certain things that, let's say, characteristic of the 20th century as opposed to the 19th century. And the contrast that it drew was an emphasis on personality rather than character. Now, there's nothing wrong with personality. There are many of these things, but the problem, what we have to realize is that the world always tends to be like a pendulum. And they swing from one extreme to the other extreme, and they stay in the middle just about as short a time as it takes them to get on a cross. So the world is unbalanced in its perspective. The appreciation of individuality and personality is not wrong, but in a right balance. To an extreme, it becomes just a self-centered, selfish, self-focused society where everyone wants the whole world to revolve around them. They think they're the center of the universe. Now, that's a very immature concept. That's what a little baby starts out with, everything revolves around him. His world is himself. So that's very immature. That's obviously the only place a little baby can start, but part of maturing is growing and realizing that the world is a bigger place and there are others to be considered other than just ourselves. A person who goes through life only considering his own wants and needs and feelings is going to be a very selfish individual. There is to be an importance that is given to loyalty. And we can see that, when God selected Joseph, the husband of Mary, to be the one who would be the physical, the human father figure for Jesus Christ. He was obviously not the literal human father in the sense that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, that he was conceived of the Holy Spirit. But Joseph was the one who fulfilled the role of father in raising him up and in the role of providing for the family and being a husband to Mary and of being the one who would fulfill the responsibility of a father in the early life of Jesus the Messiah. Now, Joseph was a man who exemplified great loyalty, great protectiveness for his family. If you read the account, I'm not going to turn back there for the sake of time, but if you read the account in Matthew, you will find that at the time when Jesus was born, there was a threat, and an angel warned Joseph in a dream of what Herod was up to. And Joseph immediately got his family, and they fled down into Egypt. They remained there, and then at a later time they came back, and on realizing that one of Herod's sons was king there in Judea in his place, he moved the family up to Nazareth in Galilee. If you go through and you read the account there in Matthew chapter 2, you'll find the extent to which he was very protective, very solicitous of the well-being of his family. God picked a man who was not selfish and self-centered, who did not simply think of himself, who was not going to just go off and desert his family, who was not just primarily concerned about his own safety and his own convenience, but a man of great loyalty and devotion, a man who set that example, and certainly was that way in terms of his own family. One of the most important things that a father can give his family is his loyalty. His faithfulness, his devotion to the family. That's going to reflect itself in his faithfulness to his marriage vows. It's going to reflect itself in the way that he is protective of his wife and of his children, and the efforts that he goes through to provide for them. There's going to be a loyalty that is going to be exemplified, a loyalty to his wife, a loyalty to his children. The second characteristic that I would want to focus on this morning, not only is loyalty an important thing for a father to give his family, but also leadership is an extremely important thing for a father to give his family. To give him his loyalty and to give him his leadership. Leadership involves a lot of things. Many times we see today the wrong emphasis, wrong kinds of leadership. In some cases there's no particular leadership at all. Usually the cartoon variety, from the old Dagwood and Blondie right on through the various other cartoons, always sort of use the formula where the father's not really the one who's going to provide any leadership. He's just kind of standing there, and he's the one that they have to kind of work around and duck under, and is always just really more of a useless appendage than the real leader of his family. Now, leadership involves various things. Certainly, leadership involves the guiding of the family, the teaching of the family, the discipline of the family. We have brought out in Hebrews in chapter 12, let's just notice a little bit of insight here in terms of the role of the father. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, Paul says, You have forgotten the exhortation which speaks unto you as unto children. My son, despise not you the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you are rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as his son. So what son is he whom the Father chastens not? If you're without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are you bastards? You're not sons. You're not legitimate. You're not claimed. God doesn't claim you as his. He says, furthermore, we've had fathers of our flesh that corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much more rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they truly, for a few days, chastened us after their own fashion, or chastened us as it seemed good or fitting to them. They chastened us, they disciplined us as it seemed appropriate to them. But God always does it for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. No chastening for the present seems to be joyous, but grievous, nevertheless afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Now, one of the things that we have brought out here is the father's relationship to the family, and the father is very much involved in the rearing of the family, the rearing of his children. Hebrews chapter 12 uses the analogy of a father's relationship with his children as an analogy of God's relationship with us. Now, it involves the whole realm of guidance, of discipline, of coaching. That's a part of leadership. We're going to go on through. We're going to see that's by no means all of leadership, but that is a part. That is a part of leadership, that the father is involved with his family. He's involved in the guidance and in the discipline. He is involved in setting appropriate boundaries. And he does this because he is concerned about the way that his children are going to turn out and the way that they're going to go. And the admonition, because, of course, we sometimes it's hard to get a right balance on that. Men have a tendency to sometimes be, there's a need for a certain softening influence, and men can, left to their own, be many times overly hard. There is just a sort of a natural assertiveness that is common in men, and that's why God includes the admonition in Ephesians 6:4. You fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Don't provoke them to wrath. Don't be conscious and careful as to the way that you administer this discipline. When it talks about provoking them to wrath, if you look it up, what it's really discussing is talking about discouraging a child. It is talking about the kind of thing that just sort of brings someone down and belittles them and discourages them, being so overly hard that a child is driven to the other extreme, driven away from obedience and to disobedience. To bring them up in the nurture, that involves, that word means discipline in the Greek language. It's the word that is translated chastening there in Hebrews 12. The word that we just got through reading in Hebrews 12, everywhere it said chastening, and it's the same word that's translated nurture here. It is a word that means to bring up in the discipline of the Lord, and also in the admonition, which has to do with admonishing, warning, instruction. So there is an importance there that a right and proper balance be used in terms of the family, in terms of the leadership and the instruction and discipline in the family. Colossians 3:21 says basically the same thing, slightly different words. It says, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. So, leadership is an important thing for the father to give in the family, but it is something that must be given in a right way and in a balanced way, not in a way that is going to be destructive to the best interest of the family and of the children. Back in the book of Genesis, we read of Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, we read what God said of Abraham. Abraham was a man who exerted leadership in his family, and he did so in a balanced way. Now, God said of Abraham in Genesis 18, verse 18, seeing that Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know this, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the eternal to do justice and judgment, that the eternal may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of. God prepared Abraham to be a father. You know, the work of God in Abraham's day is building a family. This is the family through which God was going to work. It was the family through which the knowledge of God's way and God's truth and God's word were going to be preserved. It was the family into which the Messiah would ultimately be born. The importance of establishing a family and of properly establishing that family, of laying the right foundation for that family, was crucial. When God picked Abraham, he chose Abraham, and he worked with Abraham for a number of years. And finally, Abraham was, in fact, at the time God revealed this right here in Genesis 18, the time that God said this about Abraham. Abraham had not had his son Isaac yet. The son of promise had not yet been born. But God waited until he knew of Abraham, and it could be said that Abraham would exert proper leadership in his family. Abraham was not going to be passive wimp of a guy who was going to sort of sit back and let his kids run riot all over the place. He was not going to be one who was going to so oppress and overlord his family that the kids just couldn't wait until they were just going to rebel and go out from under him. Rather, God knew that Abraham would exemplify proper leadership in his family, and that he would carry the kind of weight in his family, that he would command his children in his household, and he would set a standard and a way of life that would be remembered and preserved for generations forward. Abraham exemplified many characteristics, and God said, I know him, that he'll command his children in his household after him. Now, one very important aspect of leadership, God desires for a father to give his family loyalty, to give them leadership, which involves a proper teaching, proper example, a proper setting of standards, a proper and appropriate involvement with the family and with the decision making in the family. And this is highlighted right here. When Paul was giving instruction concerning the ordination of elders, when he was giving Timothy instruction about ordaining elders, he said in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, one of the things that he said concerning the office of a bishop or overseer, an elder in God's church, is, in verse 4, one that rules well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? One of the things that Paul focused on as he gave Timothy instruction was he said, Timothy, now, as you look for men to ordain as elders, look at their example and look at their family life, because you will be able to tell quite a bit about the kind of leadership a man will exert in the church by looking at the kind of leadership he exerts in his family. Does he go to extremes? Is he so passive that he just allows things to run riot? Is he so oppressive that he just grinds every member of the family into the ground? Does he go to extremes? Or is he balanced? Does he properly govern and administer his family? What are the results in his family? What kind of family life does he have? Well, Paul was giving Timothy a way to gain insight into how a man would administer the church. And he said the way he'll administer the church, basically the way he administers his family. Leadership is very important. Now, Jesus Christ brought out an aspect of leadership that the world has never properly understood. He brought it out on various occasions. He brought it out really throughout his entire life, but he certainly brought it out in terms of the final night prior to his crucifixion, the night of his Passover with the disciples. We have the example here in John chapter 13 of Jesus arising from supper, laying aside his outer garment, taking a towel and girding himself with it, pouring water in a basin and beginning to wash the disciples' feet. And Jesus said to them down in verse 13 of John 13 after he had finished, in chapter 12 when he put back on his coat, he said, "Do you know what I've done? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am." That's appropriate, that's proper. You show me respect, and you evidence that respect by the way you address me, and that's appropriate, he said. That's fine, because you should show me that respect. I am your Master, I am your Lord. But, verse 14, if I then, your Lord, your Master, your leader, if I have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should do as I have done unto you. Truly I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that sent greater than he that sent him. The point that Jesus Christ made right here is he laid emphasis on some of these things was a willingness to serve, a willingness to help, a willingness to give, a serving attitude, and the importance of realizing the role of service in leadership. In Luke chapter 22, we have another account of the same evening. And really, what we have accounted for here is something that probably set the stage for the foot washing. In Luke 22, verse 24, we are told that there was also a strife among them, among the disciples, which of them should be accounted the greatest. You know, they were sitting there arguing about which one was the most important and which one was going to have the highest position. And he said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. They exercise dominion. Those that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. But you shall not be so. He that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He that is chief as he that does serve. Who is greater? Which is greater? He that sits at meat or he that serves? Is not he that sits at meat, but I am among you as he that serves. So he went on and he talked about the kingdom that he was going to appoint them, the kingdom that his father was giving him, and how they would sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. But he was stressing to them that in terms of the leadership that they were to exercise, that it was to be a totally different brand of leadership than what passed for leadership in the Roman world around then. The leadership that they saw exercised was a leadership of oppression, a leadership that in many cases involved dictators, involved pompous military generals that had others sort of groveling before them. The examples of leadership they saw really were examples of lording it over someone else. Jesus Christ stressed that leadership involves service. Leadership involves service. That proper leadership, godly leadership, involves a serving attitude, a giving attitude, an attitude of willingness to build and to help. So, when we talk about the leadership that a father needs to exemplify in his family, that one of the greatest things, most important things that he can give his family is leadership. We're talking about Christian leadership, godly leadership. We're talking about avoiding the two extremes that have been so common through the centuries of the world around us. The extremes of one of a very passive, uninvolved father, one who just sort of in some cases is not even physically present. Some cases they're physically present, but emotionally they're not there. They're not involved. They're not taking an active role. But the absence of that proper masculine leading presence, that proper masculine leadership, one extreme is just simply being uninvolved, this sort of passive thing that comes up, and we see it reflected all around in our society. Many of the problems that come out. You know, the thing that just strikes me as the epitome of it is you've got in various localities parents who come down and who sort of plead with the city council or those in authority to pass a curfew to make their kids come in off the street. That just kind of boggles my mind. I cannot, for some reason, I just cannot understand the fact of being in a situation where, as a father, I need, I'm sort of standing, helplessly by, and I hope that the law will come and make my children come home at night. My dad wasn't in the church, but it never occurred to him that he had to call on somebody else to enforce his rules on me. He was all that he needed to enforce those rules. And I knew that, and so did my brother. So it just, this sort of passive abdication of responsibility and leadership, this lack of active involvement and proper discipline and setting of standards, that's one extreme, and that is something that is becoming increasingly common in our society in modern America. We have had virtually an emasculated culture that has developed in the latter 20th century United States, and accompanying with it a lack of proper masculine leadership. That certainly represents one extreme. The other extreme involves some sort of oppressive, just grind them in the dirt kind of leadership, and that's not really leadership either. That is an oppressive, sort of dictatorial approach that is just based on the whim of the individual. I've got power, and I'm going to use it to grind you down. And that is not proper leadership at all. But proper leadership involves a balanced leadership. It is a leadership that is predicated on a desire to serve and to give and to build up, a desire to help. And based upon that, God inspired Paul to write that God chastens every son whom he loves. Proper discipline flows as an outgrowth of love. I discipline my children and have over the years because I love them. And I want them to grow up adhering to certain standards and certain values. That's the basis by which a father should exert that discipline in the family. That's stressed throughout the Scriptures. It involves teaching. Abraham was one that God singled out as an example of teaching his family. If you really want to draw a contrast in child rearing and in proper leadership in the family, go through and study the contrasting lives of Lot and Abraham. And what was the response, what was the outgrowth of their families? What were the consequences in their families? Abraham took great concern in terms of the teaching of his family and the direction of his family. And God knew that he could count on Abraham to exercise that sort of leadership in his family. And he said that, Huffy, in Genesis chapter 18. So a father should give his family his loyalty. He should give them his leadership. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, and really the one that underlies and is the basis for loyalty and leadership, is that a father should give his family his love. Now, his loyalty, his leadership, and his love are the three things that his family needs from him the most. And ultimately, his love is really the basis for his loyalty to his family, and it is the basis for his proper leadership of his family. We're told, in terms of our relationship with God, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, we're told, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." The thing that we're told about God and our relationship with God is that we can cast all our cares on him, for he cares for us. So the basis of our relationship with God is a relationship of love. God loves us. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So we are told various things that focus in on God's love, and that is the basis of our relationship with God. Now, that is to be the relationship, the basis of a relationship of children with their parents, children with their father, that we can cast our cares on him, for he cares for us. That's the attitude that a young child should grow up with, of realizing that there is a source of caring, there is a source there's a source of help. Now, the importance of this third point really can't be overemphasized. It is a lack of love, a lack of expression of that love, a lack of properly expressing and emphasizing that love, that leads to an awful lot of problems that people experience. Well, Jesus, at the time that he was baptized, you remember the account that's given in the Gospels when he came to John the Baptist and he was baptized of John, that when he came up out of the water, that there was a voice that spoke from heaven that said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Now, you find other accounts of that, but there's something that's very important in that. You know, God the Father expressed openly, he expressed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Unfortunately, there are a lot of children that have grown up that have never heard those words from their physical father. They've never heard that this is my beloved son, this is my beloved daughter, in whom I'm well pleased. There are those who go through life always craving and seeking the approval of other people. They are hungry for people to approve of them, to accept them, to somehow say, "You're okay." And what I've found almost inevitably in talking and counseling with people who had this sort of craving to be accepted, to be approved of, always trying to prove, to win the approval of others. They were what are termed approval seekers. They were always trying to prove something, to prove that they could be a success, that they were okay. One thing that I found in nearly all of those cases is they never really felt approved of, accepted by their father. And so, in reality, they are going through life searching on a quest for that blessing that should have been conveyed by the father in the home. You know, you think about that. There are many accounts of the father blessing his family. You go through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you read of Jacob gathering his sons around him prior to his death, as he gathered his sons there, recorded there in Genesis 49. A little while prior to that, he had gathered, brought Ephraim and Manasseh there. I understand that there's a prophetic implication to that, and he was under God's inspiration speaking of a future that was going to come to pass. But you know, there's another aspect of it, that there are various aspects of that blessing that were conveyed. And one aspect of it was simply that is it describes him gathering them there and bringing them there in that affectionate embrace and expressing to them his love for them, his approval of them, describing for them the great things that he foresaw for them, the special things that were there in their future. That he conveyed to them as God's human instrument a sense of approval, a sense of acceptance, a sense of love and blessing. And apart from the specific prophetic aspect of that, there is a very important human aspect. And there is a very important aspect that needs to be conveyed that is appropriate to be conveyed. One of the most important responsibilities of a father is to convey his love for his family, to convey to his children that sense of love and blessing that is a source of security, is a source of confidence, that is a source of, you know, your family, if you can't, well, let's put it this way, if you can't be accepted there simply for who you are, not for what you've done or what you've accomplished, where will you be so accepted? You know, when I visit with family members back several weeks ago, had a chance to get together with some family members, some on a Sunday, some cousins up in Arkansas that don't see and get together with all that often. But there was a sense of the acceptance. They found out I was going to be nearby, and they wanted me. Their family was getting together, and they were hoping that some of us could come and could join them and spend the afternoon there with them. The desire of a family to spend time with one another, it's not based on what you've done. It's not based on the accomplishments that you have rendered and all of these things. You know, in the world around, many times we're accepted based on what we've done. You've accomplished some great thing. You've done this. You've done that. People want to associate with you. But you know, a family is the place you start out. That's the basis of where you're accepted. That's the one place where you're accepted simply for who you are. You're accepted as you, not because of what you've done, because of what you've accomplished and what you've achieved and any great things you've done or accomplished. That's the basis of where you're simply accepted for who you are. You're part of the family. You're there because you're part of the family, not because you have earned this degree and accomplished this great thing and gone and done this and achieved that. You're there. You're accepted. You are a part of things simply and solely because you're part of the family. You're included because you're part of the family. There is an important concept that needs to be conveyed because that becomes the basis by which a child is shaped, the crucible, if you will, in which a child is molded and shaped and takes on a certain outlook of life as they grow up and as they go forth into the world. And if there is not that one place where you know that there are those who accept you simply for who you are, they accept you because you're part of their family, then there's a real problem. And people who lack that really go through life striving and looking for acceptance and approval. And unfortunately, many times they go through life looking in all the wrong places with all the wrong people. Many, many times. And you could go through a whole host of modern social problems, and they're not modern in the sense that they're new to our day and our time, but they're certainly very much a part of the modern world. We could go through and focus in on many, many of those things. And this becomes an important realization. I think that one of the most important things, I feel like that the most important legacy that my father gave me was his love. You know, I remember when I graduated from college. I graduated on a Friday. My wife and I were married on a Sunday. Now, my dad was a hard worker. In fact, all the time I was growing up, he ran a little country grocery store and farmed and raised cattle. I never knew him to take off and go somewhere. I mean, the idea of closing up the store, because if he took off, he had to close the store because he and my mother were all there was there to operate it. And to my knowledge, I don't guess it was ever closed. I mean, if there was ever a weekday when it didn't open. He was open 6 days a week. When he got up in the morning, 7 o'clock, he went out and he opened the store, and when he got ready to go to bed at night, 10 o'clock, he closed the door and went to the store. The store was almost our living room in the sense that, any of you been around a small little community, you realize that business sort of comes and goes, and a lot of times there's nothing going on, and, we'd be sitting in chairs there around the old wood heater in the middle of the floor there of the store and talking or doing whatever, and a customer came in, you waited on him. But that was 6 days a week, and on Sunday he wasn't open, but he except early in the morning. He'd open up before church so people could come get some gas or milk or whatever they wanted, and that was Sunday from about 9 o'clock on. That was the only time that I ever knew him to be closed. I don't think there was a day that ever passed that he didn't open at least some. And to my knowledge, the first time he ever closed down the store was to do something that was totally unprecedented for him. When I graduated from college, he did two things that were unprecedented. One, he closed the store for about a week because he and my mother came out to California. The other thing was that he flew. Now, the only two times that he ever got on an airplane in his life were to come out to watch me graduate and get married, and to come out when my brother did the same thing. He was, not interested in flying at all. But he had an incentive to do that. Now, he had never traveled and never been very far away from about the height of his travelings had been Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana and maybe into Mississippi. But he came to California when we were married and graduated, and later 2 years later when my brother was. But in that, among many other ways, it was conveyed the love that was there. And that was something that I'm very thankful that I always sensed. Those were the very last words that he ever spoke to me and to my mother and to my brother just moments prior to his death. But that wasn't the first time he had ever said those words. He said those words many times down through the years, and it, I think, is only in retrospect as we get older that sometimes we look back and we appreciate and realize how valuable certain things are, and sometimes things that we take for granted that we realize are not things that should be just kind of taken for granted and assumed that that's just automatic. But as we focus in on these things and on the role of the family in God's plan and on the role of the father in God's family, I can't think of any three things that are more important for a father to give his family than his loyalty, his leadership, and his love. And His love is really the basis of his loyalty, and it is the basis of his leadership. Now, none of us can choose our past. None of us can choose our families in terms of our families of origin. We can't go back, and we can't change the things that we have experienced. We can't change our past. But one thing, we can still go forward. We can still learn and realize the importance of putting into practice these principles. And for those who grew up and whose lives have been influenced by the lack of a father, either the physical lack of a father because of death, because of divorce, because of desertion, because of any number of things, or in some cases simply the emotional lack of a father who may have been there physically and yet was never really there emotionally. There's a statement that God makes in Psalm 68. In Psalm 68 in verse 5, it talks, in verse 3 of Psalm 68, it says, "Let the righteous be glad, and let them rejoice before God. Yes, let them rejoice, exceedingly rejoice." And in verse 5, speaking of God, "A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. God sets the solitary in families. He brings out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land." You know, Jesus told his disciples, those who forsook family, those who lost their families as a result of obedience to him, he said, "No man has given up father or mother or brother or sisters for my sake, that shall not receive manyfold, both in this life and in the world to come." God is ultimately our Father. God is a father to the fatherless. He is the one to whom we can all look. God's loyalty, his leadership, and his love are perfect loyalty and perfect leadership and perfect love. And that's something that no human parent, no human father, no human being can ever claim. We can only, at our very best, imperfectly reflect what God gives. But God is a father to the fatherless. And he sets the solitary in families. You know, God's church is a family and should be a family. And as we reflect on the relationship that we need to have, learning how to put into practice the relationship in our own families and whatever point in our life God has called us. Sometimes some are called and they're at a point in their life where much of their life, most of their life is behind. Others are called at a younger age where most of their life is in front of them. We can apply and should apply these principles as we have opportunity and as our circumstances present themselves. But these are principles that need to be inculcated into our life and into our way of thinking. And regardless of what we experience in our past, we can recognize that God is a father to the fatherless. He reveals himself as such. And that he will set even the solitary in family. He will provide that extended family and that nurturing and that acceptance and those things that need to be there. We need to examine our role in being a part of that, in producing and developing that sort of an atmosphere in God's church and among God's people. We need to focus in on the responsibility we have on the importance of the loyalty, the leadership, and the love that those of us who are fathers need to exemplify in our own families, that we need to instill in our children and our boys growing up, the importance of those things, of those characteristics, because they're essential to building the kind of healthy and godly family that God designed, that He created, and that is a very type and representation of the kingdom of God, into which ultimately we can be born and share life with God on out into eternity.